Phew, that was something. Now, thank you for watching my video about the Opium Wars. I hope you enjoyed my video about the Opium Wars. It took a really long time to make. I know I said this in the last video, but my intention was to make a quick 20-minute video. You know, I had like the massive project of Israel versus Palestine, which was a 2-part video. I think it was like almost an hour of content. And then I was like, I just want to chill. So let's do a very simple or quick topic. I said, you know what? War of 1812. It ended up being like 40 minutes of animations. After that, I was like, you know what? That's it. I'm taking it easy. I'm gonna go for the Open Wars. Just a very quick, simple conflict. It's gonna be 20 minutes. And that way, you know, easy video. And here I am, once again, 40 minutes of animations. Oh my God. I swear to God, the next video is just gonna be 20 minutes. All right, I plan to do a quick 20-minute video, and this time it's for real. And then I'm gonna go for a nice, you know, 2-part video of a much more complex topic. So, but I promise it's gonna be 20 minutes this time. So anyways, there's a lot of things that I wanna talk about regarding the video that I just made. And first of all, you know, a big shout out to my Animator Cam. I'm gonna have his socials in the description, like as usual. He did a great job. We are usually splitting the work, but he has been teaching me a lot of things, and I feel like the quality of animation has been improving each time. I really took I really wanted to make this video a little bit different. I had a lot of like longer dialogue scenes with, you know, that were... This video, I really wanted to try to have some longer dialogue scenes, you know, when I could just have a bunch of jokes, like what was going on with MacArthur and Lord Amherst. And now I just want to point out, I mean, when I was researching about this topic and I just learned about those expeditions, I just knew that I had to make those scenes. I originally planned to make Lord Amherst's like dialogue scene with outside of the court, you know, where they're like, hey, you gotta kowtow. I was going to make like a couple more jokes because I thought it was really funny. I mentioned it in the video when Lord Amherst refuses to kowtow and instead says, well, what if I, you know, kneel with one knee once and then bow my head 3 times and repeat that whole thing 3 times? He actually suggested that. So there were like actual negotiations going on about how he could, you know, kind of kowtow without actually kowtowing. And it was really ridiculous, especially considering that not even the British king really cared. He was like, bro, just do the kowtow, no one cares. But somehow the British envoys just kept having problems with that. So I thought it was really funny, and I thought it was gonna, you know, translate very naturally into a funny scene. And honestly, I think it ended up being quite funny. I hope you guys thought it was funny as well. And there's a few things I really wanted to be able to address, and one of them was what is usually called the Middle Kingdom complex or Middle Kingdom syndrome, because China in that time, as I mentioned in the video, had a bit of an unrealistic idea of how strong they were. And I mentioned it very briefly. I think it was before Jia Qing's letter to the British king, where they actually thought, you know, that England was like just that small island somewhere. They really had no idea who they were dealing with. And yeah, they really thought they were a very big deal. And that's why it's called Middle Kingdom syndrome. China in Chinese is literally called Zhongguo, which is the Middle Kingdom. So they really had their heads up their asses. There's no other way to say it. And I think that also allowed for a lot of funny interactions, right, between the Chinese and the British, both being quite arrogant. But the things that the British had something to back that up, the Chinese didn't. And Yeah, I mean, the video ended up being, I think, half of it is just like the build up towards the Opium Wars. The wars themselves are very brief. I mean, I think you can barely even call them wars. After all, it's mostly European countries just bullying China into submission. It's not like there's any contest. You have, a couple instances where the Chinese actually, managed to deal some sort of damage to the European forces, but it's mostly because of the European overconfidence that it ends up happening. So there's not really too much they could do during the wars. Now, the whole corruption scenes, I think, are just so funny. So, first of all, there's the whole situation with Ho Shan, right? The guy who embezzled like half of the country's earnings. I think he was literally one of the richest persons to ever live. And I thought about spending some time on that and making a couple jokes. But the problem is that my video was already like 40 minutes long. There's so many things that I ended up cutting out of the video. Otherwise, it would have been even longer. But yeah, I mean, imagine someone stealing half of the annual budget of the United States. Like, that is an insane amount of money. And that's basically what this guy was doing. So the amount of corruption there is crazy. And there's that one scene of the Battle of Kowloon, right? Where you have the British sailors who drunkenly kill a Chinese farmer. The British refused to give the guy up. That happened a lot, actually. It was a very common thing. The British wanted to try their subjects themselves. The Chinese had a bit of a tendency of strangling people to death as a punishment. The British didn't want that. And there ended up being this little battle. And the Chinese basically forbid other Chinese from selling supplies to the British. And something I think is really funny is that after that little battle, a Chinese commander reported to his superiors that they had sunk 2 British warships, killed like 40 sailors, and prevented them from getting any supplies at all. And literally every single part of that was false, which I thought it was really funny. Like, the British won that battle. So yeah, I think it's funny how there's even in the small things, corruption was so incredibly rampant. Yeah, another thing I wanted to talk about, I mean, this is all over the place, but honestly, it was a lot of work getting these videos out. So this is kind of an opportunity for me to rant and just, I don't know, get it out of my chest. It's been a lot of work. I promise my next video is going to be up faster. In fact, I have to have it up by the end of January. So I'm going to be working a lot on that. But yeah, that's why it's not going to be that long either, maybe 20 minutes. But anyways, a problem I run into while doing this video is that different sources from different times tend to translate the Chinese names differently. So pinyin, which is kind of the way in which we can write in Western letters the Chinese characters, it was invented relatively recently. So books that are kind of old tend to not really use it the way it's used currently. So basically, you can run into problems. For example, it happens with Nanjing, right? Nanjing versus Nanking, Tianjin versus Tianjin, Dagu versus Taku. You have it with Canton versus Guangzhou, and it happens with a lot of places. Beijing and Peking, right? It happens a lot, and if you are not careful, you can easily think that 2 names are 2 different places. If you're reading from different sources and you're not, checking carefully, you may think, oh, you have these 2 different treaties, Nanjing and or Tianjin and Tianjin, and it ends up being, something else. So, or basically the same event but with different names. So that's something that you really gotta be very careful whenever you're doing anything related to China, especially older things where there wasn't really that much of a standard way of writing the Chinese characters. So that I made a couple of mistakes that I thankfully managed to correct before it was too late. another thing that was quite interesting is that when the Elliots arrived in China, they were given a letter that they needed to deliver with their demands. So I think it was in Amoy, and they tried to go ahead and deliver the letter. So they got on a ship, raised a white flag, right, which means, we don't want to fight you. But the thing is that was a symbol used by Westerners, and China was so isolated that they were not familiar with the symbol of the white flag. So they just shot at the ship thinking they were under attack, and that little mission failed, which I think is also quite interesting. I was going to include that as well, but I mean, some things you just gotta cut out, right? I'm not gonna make a 2-hour documentary, so I left it out. But that's also why I really like making these videos, because some things that I just end up cutting out, I can just mention here and, I don't know, sleep with a clear conscience that I mentioned everything that I wanted to mention. And with regards to the unequal treaties, it is quite interesting that, well, there's a lot of things I didn't mention. A lot of countries end up like jumping into the action. You even have Russia that seized a bit of territory. I don't think I mentioned that too much. Again, because there's a lot of background to the conflict with Russia as well, and I just really didn't want to get into that in this video, so I didn't. and yeah, but it's interesting because when the Europeans, or basically like the US, France, they see that British got all these, or the British got all these concessions, they want something as well, right? Oh, that was easy. We want it too. And the Chinese do end up deciding to give it to them, because they're like, well, if we don't give them these concessions, they are just going to trade with us using British licenses, right? So there's no real way of stopping them. At least that way they got, like a bit more formal relations with those countries, and maybe they can, have them compete a little bit against the British and French, and kind of thwart the British power as well. So that was kind of the reason there. I didn't get too much into it in the video, but I think it's interesting to mention at least, very quickly. So something else that I mentioned is that by the end of the Second Opium War, you have the British who burned down the Summer Palace. And I mentioned that it was not only, but it was also partially motivated by the torture of British negotiators. So I didn't really go into that. So what happens is that the British sent a delegation to ratify the Treaty of Nanjing that had been signed very recently. But the Chinese doubted their intentions. They thought they were going to be spies, or at least that's their justification. And they ended up imprisoning that delegation. They tortured many of them and had them under just overall very harsh conditions, to the point that I think like 20 of them died or something, which is why the British then wanted to get this payback. But it wasn't just because of that, right? In the end, burning down the Summer Palace, a symbol of the might and power of the Qing dynasty, is also, it basically shows, it's a message to all of China, right? Like, these are your rulers, they can't protect you, this is what happens when you mess with us. And yeah, it's just a very, very clear symbol that China is completely powerless to stop the Europeans. And I mean, imagine what that feels like. I guess if you're like an American, imagine, I don't know, maybe China or Russia just absolutely crushing your armies and then burning down, I don't know, not only the White House, it's more than that because of how like magnificent the Summer Palace was. It wasn't just like a building designed for political events or something like that. It was something that it was luxurious. Like it's like burning down, I don't know, Versailles or something like that, right? So that sends a deep message, and that really sparks a lot of resentment, and it makes Chinese question their government as well. So that's very important. So that burning is key, and in fact, to this day, there are some aspects of the palace and its gardens that have been restored, but I know there are many that are still kept in the same destroyed state. A bit of as a reminder, they have like plaques where they explain this is what happened when the Europeans came. And I don't think we can really understand as Westerners just how deeply this impacted the worldview of the Chinese, right? Being so isolated for so long, thinking you are, the mightiest country in the planet, and then getting just utterly and completely humiliated. Like, I don't know how many countries have gone through a humiliation like that, because it's one thing to lose a war, but I mean, yeah, they were just humiliated. I mean, opium was legalized again at the end of the Opium Wars, and it remained legal until, I think, the times of the Communist Party. So quite a few decades more. And I think that's why it's really no surprise that there were also so many peasant rebellions. I mean, I mentioned like the Nian Rebellion. I don't know if I mentioned it by name, but that's one of the ones that I meant. You had the Taiping Rebellion, right? And later on, you are going to have even more rebellions because people are just losing faith in the government. I mean, things were not really great to begin with. And after people saw just how useless the government was in trying to defend them from outside forces, I mean, yeah, people just lost faith in them. That's one of the reasons why that little attack at San Yuan Li that I mentioned, that didn't really deal all that much damage to British forces, but it really showed like Chinese people getting together. And this is in fact one of the things that inspired the Taiping Rebellion and also the Nian Rebellion. And even more after, right? It became a symbol afterwards. And yeah, I think that's important. And in those rebellions, it's very interesting because, for example, in the case of the Nian Rebellion, people had slogans that were kill the officials, kill the rich, and spare the poor. And I think I mentioned that in every rebellion, basically, even like in the White Lotus Rebellion, it was very common to target merchants, rich landlords, to burn land deeds, to burn tax records. So I feel like there was a sense of, us versus them, as in the peasants versus the rich landowners. And that would be very important because in the years to come, right, you're going to have I guess it's still a few years away, but eventually you would have the Chinese Revolution. And one of the driving forces would still be the need for land reform, right? Because when you have such a hierarchical state as is China, where few people control all of the land, right? Peasants just don't like that at all. It's incredibly bad, a very bad living situation. So it's very interesting to see. It's not like these rebellions were in any way socialist or communist. It's completely ahistorical to call it that way, because those ideas didn't really get there. We saw at the end of the video when China starts sending people to Europe to study, that's actually where some ideas such as Marxism are going to end up coming to China, and they would develop some of their own visions of what socialism and communism look like, right? You would have a completely different way of understanding what those ideas are coming from Mao and Maoism overall. And that makes sense because Europeans have a different understanding of the political situation than a Chinese peasant. In Europe, in Germany, you have a very well-defined, merchant class. You have very well-defined capitalist class, right? With massive factories, with colonies, huge empires, and you would have workers who, are clearly seeing the struggles that they face and the power that the capitalists hold. But on the other side, in China, there is still not really like such a well-defined worker force in like the capitalist sense. Right? You have just a lot of people who work the land and a lot of people who own the land. There are some first capitalists arising. Right? There's like some sort of proto-capitalism emerging. It's kind of mostly feudal still, at least in the time of the Opium War. But that really goes to show how it would develop so differently, right? That's why a lot of socialism in third world countries ends up being very different from those in the first world, right? So I don't know. I always think that's interesting to consider. So yeah, I guess you could see those rebellions as kind of precursors for what would be the Chinese communist movements. I definitely want to make a video about that eventually, but I think it's going to be a while. But that's also why I want to cover this video, because I feel like you can't really talk about the Chinese civil war and the revolution without having covered this. I may have to cover a bit more before that. I'll take a look at that. But yeah, anyways. Yeah, I don't know. I lost my focus. So another thing I wanted to comment about Hong Xiuquan and the Taiping Rebellion is that it's interesting that they did some, quite progressive reforms as well. Now, don't get me wrong. So some of the things he did is that he abolished land ownership, as was usually done. He mandated the destruction of basically any religious icons that were not like Catholic, even though his form of Catholicism is obviously not really traditional, right? He himself is like, oh, I'm the brother of Jesus Christ. That goes directly against Catholicism. And he also like combined it a little bit with some like of that spiritualism that was common in China. But he did promote the gender equality, which is very interesting. He declared the complete equality between men and women. Now, how much of that ended up working in praxis, I don't really know. But I do know that at least 100,000 soldiers in his army were women who fought alongside him, or for him, I guess. So that's very interesting. Now, that rebellion itself is massive, and putting it down was very difficult. And honestly, I mean, I guess I could make a video about that, but I think that maybe in the far future, it's not really something I want to focus too much on, at least for now. Now, another thing I do want to comment is, by the end of the video, right, I briefly mentioned some attempts to like westernize, or not just westernize, but to try to reform China a little bit, right? Like the Tongji Restoration and the self-strengthening movement, which I kind of combined into one in the video, because again, there are like very complex issues and I didn't want to go into them, so I just like cramped them up in there. But they were basically attempts that China made to try to catch up to speed with the rest. And I think it's always interesting to see how Japan reacted in their own restoration attempts versus how China did it. China was just too self-absorbed, too corrupt, and they just didn't really get the message through that they were not a powerhouse anymore. They were barely a house. But Japan really understood that. And that's why they did, honestly, a great job of becoming very powerful. Honestly, they went up to do some incredibly horrifying stuff later. But they objectively were successful in modernizing. And China was not. And in fact, that would go ahead and bite the Chinese in the behind a couple of times, right? And eventually lead to the Japanese invasion of China, which was atrocious. So that is very interesting to see. And one of the examples I gave, right, is the Empress Dowager Cixi, who really opposed basically anything that her son wanted to do. She was not the only one. There were many, many conservative forces in the court, so it's not just her. But I made a little joke about her like wanting to kill her son. Now, I know there are rumors about her maybe having something to do with it, which is why I made the joke. But from all I could find, I think the son died from like an illness. It's very unlikely that her mother had anything to do with it. But still, I mean, she definitely went against him every step of the way. So that's quite important. And also, the detail I mentioned at the end, right, where the son, the Tongji Emperor, wants a modern navy built, and the mother goes ahead and uses part of the money to restore a luxury marble ship. That is such a good example of the kind of things that would happen under the Qing. And that happened in so many different aspects. Like, oh, you know, we need some dikes for the Yangtze River because it's flooding every 5 minutes and killing a bunch of people. And instead of doing that, people would just straight up lie about it. And they say, oh yeah, we totally did it, and then just steal the money and use it for something else. So that was so incredibly commonplace, which is also why it was so difficult for China to then, you know, come back from all of this. They would have to go through a very long process, and yeah, it would eventually lead to, as I mentioned, the civil war, the communists getting into power, and everything that came after. So I really want to go into that at some point. It may take me a while, but it's definitely on my list. So I think that I went through everything that I wanted to talk about. So I think I went through everything that I wanted to talk about. So yeah, I mean, thank you very much for watching this. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts. And also tune in to my Twitch stream. I'm going to be streaming on Twitch starting this new year. So starting January 2025, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I got confused there with the days. Starting at around like 5 or 6 p.m. my time, which I guess I'm gonna have to look it up. Which is 7 to 8 p.m. Wait, what? Which is 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. Just so you guys know, it's gonna be twitch.tv/tkanik. I'd love to see you there. I usually cover current events, news. We just discuss whatever is happening in the world that may be interesting, and I'd love to have you there. So yeah, and sometimes I give a little bit of spoilers of what the next video is going to be, but for now, I guess it's going to be a mystery. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I guess I'll see you in the next behind the scenes vlog. And yeah, I may be doing some reaction videos to some content every now and then, so you know, if you're interested, why not check it out?